Welcome back to Biology with Mrs. Evans. Today we're going to be looking at population growth. There are two types of population growth. There is exponential growth and then there is logistic growth. In exponential growth, the population is able to grow exponentially because they have unlimited resources, and it is usually represented by a J graph as you see here. The population is increasing and at a steady rate because they have unlimited resources. Very rarely are there unlimited resources. Eventually, the resources become limited, and the population size or population growth levels out, which you will see in a minute. So resources, like I said, never stay unlimited for long because as population grows, certain resources become limited, such as food, water, and shelter. All right, anything that restricts the growth of a population is called a limiting factor. There are two types of limiting factors. There are those that are density dependent, which means it depends on the population size. Those are examples of food, water, and shelter. As the population size increases, the availability of food, water, and shelter decreases. Therefore, the population size or the population growth will start to level off. Density independent limiting factors are those that don't depend on the population size, but do limit the population. Those are things like natural disaster, whether it's a fire, a hurricane, tsunami, whatever. It's going to impact the population in that area because it's going to basically wipe out anything that's living in that area. A population will grow until it reaches what's called its carrying capacity. We've seen that in some of the quizzes that we've taken. All right, it's the largest number of organisms an environment can support. All right, and so for a logistic growth curve, it's usually referred to as an S growth or an S curve because you will see, all right, that the population starts to grow exponentially here, right, until it hits basically this critical point right here where resources become limited, and then the population starts to level off. Point B would be the carrying capacity. So the population levels off at this point. You cannot exceed population growth, you cannot exceed the carrying capacity for a given area because there's only so many resources in that area. All right, a niche, we talked about that earlier in the first slide. A niche is the role that an organism plays. It's basically its job. So every member of a population fills a certain role in the ecosystem. Um, Here you see a sea otter eating basically um, probably clams or oysters or whatever. All right, a big part of an organism's niche is its place in a food chain. Food chain, sorry. Autotrophs are producers. We learned that back in Unit 5. All right, they make up the bottom of the food chain. All right, they make up the bottom of the food chain, food pyramid, food web, everything. All right, that's how we most things get their food. Heterotrophs are consumers, and remember they need to eat in order to get their name. All right, and they're given names based on how far away they are from the producer there in the chain. So you have primary consumers means they are the first one to eat the producers. Secondary consumers means they eat the first primary consumers. Each organism's place in a food chain is known as a trophic level. So you have the first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level, fourth trophic level, etc. All right, the image to the left shows both a terrestrial and aquatic food chain. So you heard me talk about their name based on what they are. So down at the bottom are your primary producers. Example would be plant, and if you're in the water, then you have phytoplankton. And then the primary consumers, those are the first to eat. So the picture shows a grasshopper. The grasshopper is eating the plant, so it is a primary consumer. Zooplankton is a primary consumer because it eats phytoplankton. A secondary consumer, again, remember I said eats the primary consumer, so the mouse is eating the grasshopper, so it is a secondary consumer. The fish that are there, the two fish that are there, they are secondary consumers because they feed on the zooplankton. The snake is a tertiary consumer, which means a third level consumer, which means that it ate the grasshopper, which ate it ate the mouse, which ate the grasshopper, which ate the plant. So it is a third level consumer, and then you see the bigger fish eating the two smaller fish. Again, tertiary consumer, third level consumer. And then the quaternary consumer, the carnivore, the orca whale eating the bigger fish, and then the falcon eating the snake. Quaternary means fourth level consumer. You can't go beyond the fourth level consumer because as you move up in trophic levels, the amount of energy that is given to those organisms decreases. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. All right, so this is an example of a food web. All right, so notice that they start with the phytoplankton down here at the primary producers, and you have your zooplankton eating the phytoplankton, etc. And then you have some vegetation over here on the bottom right that the geese and duck are eating. And this is an example of a food web. The arrows always point to what's getting the energy. All right, and a food chain is just one example of basically how energy is transferred for that area. This is a food web. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed, only converted into different forms. You should have learned that in eighth grade. That's conservation of energy. All right, so whenever an organism eats something, it only uses about 10% of the total energy in its food to make new cells and tissues. Right, 90% of it is lost as heat or used to keep the organism alive. So in a given food chain, only 10% goes to the next trophic level, right? So 90% of it is going to be either used by the organism itself or lost as heat. All right, so you can see it in the food pyramid here. You start off with 1,000 kilocalories as a producer, but only 10% of that is available for the primary consumers, the grasshoppers. And then 10% of that is available to the moles that are eating the crickets. And then 10% of that is available to the falcon, or I guess that's actually an owl. All right, so biogeochemical cycles. This one you should be very, very familiar with. You should have started learning it in the second grade. The only new part, which we talked about this year, is transpiration. All right, so you know that evaporation, and as water gets hot, water rises, and as it starts to rise, it cools and condenses, and then you have precipitation. And then the precipitation hits the ground, and then you have runoff that goes back into the lakes and things like that. And then you have groundwater infiltration and stuff like that. Transpiration is the new part. Remember, that's the when it gets too hot, plants open their stomatas. Remember, those are specialized cells in the plant that allow them to allow water to leave the cell to cool it because they don't have sweat glands like us and they don't pant like a dog. So transpiration is the loss of water from plant leaves. So that allows water to enter the water cycle as well. So that's the new part. So these are all biogeochemical cycles, how nutrients are recycled or recycled in the environment. Again, transpiration is the loss of water from plant leaves. All right, the carbon cycle, we talked about that in Unit 5 when we talked about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. That's basically all it is. Photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and gives back to us oxygen. We take the oxygen in and then we give back carbon dioxide. It's one huge cycle. Cows give off carbon dioxide and stuff like that. When we burn fossil fuels, we also put CO2 back in the air. Right, so this is an example of a CO2 in the atmosphere. So you can see photosynthesis taking out the CO2 and then giving off oxygen. We have organisms feeding on the plants, which is then basically depositing their waste on the grass, which fertilizes the grass. The grass gets taller, again, increasing photosynthesis. You have organisms that are going to break it down. You have fossil fuels from human activity, burning fossil fuels that releases CO2 in the atmosphere. Volcanoes can erupt and produce CO2 in the atmosphere as well. And then you have CO2 that is dissolved in the water. All of these examples of how CO2 in the atmosphere is basically cycled through. And you are responsible for knowing the main thing is basically photosynthesis and cellular respiration, that big cycle that cycles carbon dioxide. The nitrogen cycle, most of the atmosphere, as you know, is made up of nitrogen. You sort of learned that in ninth grade in earth science. But it is unusable by most organisms. All right, it's in a form that we cannot use. So it must be converted into nitrogen gas, which is usable by most of us. All right, so bacteria convert nitrogen. Basically, they convert the nitrogen gas, which is in the atmosphere, into usable forms. All right, so bacteria convert it into usable forms that we can use, such as NH3 or NH4. Plants take up these chemicals and use them to make proteins. All right, and then we have bacteria that also they take the nitrogen that is trapped in dead decaying bodies and return the nitrogen back to the earth. So you have organisms that do denitrification when organisms die, so that it's not trapped in dead bodies that are dead and decaying. Okay, so as I mentioned, N2, which is nitrogen gas, is in the atmosphere and it's not a usable form. So lightning strikes can convert the nitrogen gas to a usable form, such as NO3 and NO2. Plants take that up and use it, and organisms such as deer, us, anything that basically heterotrophs, that's how we get our nitrogen, is by eating plants, because it's not in a usable form for us. Plants, like I said, are able to absorb it through their roots once it has been fixed by bacteria. And then you have bacteria that are going to break it down, which is denitrification that you see there in the center right here. All right, so there's bacteria that is breaking it down and returning it back to the atmosphere. And then you have the farmer here who would also be adding nitrogen, basically fertilizer, to the ground, which would also be adding nitrogen back, basically for uptake by producers. That's the nitrogen cycle. We also have the phosphorus cycle, which is what you're going to read in your worksheet. I'm not going to go into that because it's basically when the rocks break down, it basically seeps into the ground, and that's how we get that. So that's it for biogeochemical cycles. That is ecology in a nutshell. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.